Sarah Chen stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror of her San Francisco apartment, wondering how her life had taken such an unexpected turn. The pristine white walls of her tech company's restroom seemed to mock her as she adjusted her blazer for the fourth time that morning. In just a few hours, camera crews would descend upon her family's home in the Richmond district, ready to film what her mother had enthusiastically dubbed the most important day of your life. The irony wasn't lost on her. At 28, she had successfully launched 3 apps, led a team of 15 developers at one of Silicon Valley's most promising startups, and purchased her own condo with a view of the Bay Bridge. By any measure, she was living the American dream, except for one detail that kept her mother awake at night. Sarah was single. It had started as a joke during their weekly dim sum gathering. Her mother, Lynn Chen, had been scrolling through her WeChat feed when she discovered Love Buster, a reality show that had taken the Asian American community by storm. The premise was simple yet terrifying. Parents would choose potential partners for their children based on their own criteria, leading to what the show promoted as the perfect blend of traditional values and modern love. 3 weeks and countless arguments later, Sarah found herself signed up as a contestant. The production company had been particularly excited about her profile, a successful tech executive whose traditional mother would be choosing between 3 women as potential partners. "It's groundbreaking," the producer had exclaimed during their preliminary meeting. "We've never featured a same-sex choice in an Asian family context." Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her best friend, Maya. "Don't worry, it can't be worse than that blind date with the cryptocurrency guy." But this was different. This wasn't just about dating. It was about having her love life broadcast to millions of viewers, including her entire extended family in China. Her mother had spent the past week preparing their home for filming. Every surface had been cleaned twice, new cushions adorned the living room sofa, and the kitchen was stocked with ingredients for traditional Chinese dishes that would undoubtedly become part of whatever challenges the show had planned. Mrs. Chen had even hired a feng shui consultant to ensure the house's energy would promote harmonious relationships. The most surreal part was how her mother had transformed from someone who had initially struggled with Sarah's coming out 3 years ago to a woman who now meticulously researched potential daughters-in-law. She had created spreadsheets comparing the candidates' horoscopes, family backgrounds, and career trajectories. "If I'm going to choose a woman for my daughter," she had declared, "she better be exceptional." As Sarah gathered her things to leave for the office, where she'd work until filming began that afternoon, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from her father. "Remember, your happiness is what matters most. But please humor your mother. She's only gotten through half a bottle of Beiju so far." Attached was a photo of their living room, now transformed into what looked like a television studio, with her mother directing 2 production assistants on the proper placement of ancestral photos. Sarah couldn't help but smile. Somewhere between the chaos of reality TV production and her mother's meticulous planning, this had become more than just a show. It was becoming a story about family, acceptance, and the complex dance between holding on to tradition while embracing change. As she stepped into her Tesla, Sarah realized that regardless of who her mother chose, this experience would make history, both for their family and for Asian American television. The Chen family's living room buzzed with nervous energy as 3 women arrived separately, each carrying the weight of Mrs. Chen's scrutinizing gaze. The production team had transformed the space into a makeshift studio, with strategic lighting that cast a warm glow over the traditional Chinese furniture and modern art pieces that represented the family's cultural duality. Jessica Park arrived first, precisely at 2:00 p.m. Her crisp white doctor's coat was carefully folded over her arm, having come directly from her pediatric practice in Mountain View. The production team immediately picked up on her natural grace as she bowed slightly to Mrs. Chen, presenting a carefully wrapped gift box containing premium oolong tea from Taiwan. Her Stanford Medical School credentials had initially caught Mrs. Chen's attention, but it was her weekly volunteer work at a children's hospital that had earned her a spot among the final 3. Michelle Zhang swept in at 2:15 p.m., emanating the confidence of someone who had just closed a major funding round for her AI-driven fashion startup. Her Chanel suit and Hermes bag spoke of success, but it was the jade pendant around her neck, a family heirloom from her grandmother, that made Mrs. Chen's eyes linger. The cameras captured her firm handshake with Mr. Chen, who couldn't help but be impressed by her discussion of market expansion strategies in Asia. Rachel Liu arrived last at 2:30 p.m., apologizing profusely in perfect Mandarin for the delay caused by her high school students' parent-teacher conferences. Her simple Kipo-inspired dress and understated demeanor initially seemed to pale in comparison to the other candidates. But the moment she began discussing Chinese literature with Mrs. Chen, the atmosphere shifted. Her deep understanding of cultural nuances and ability to quote Tang Dynasty poetry from memory caused the camera operator to zoom in on Mrs. Chen's surprised smile. The production team orchestrated their first group interaction in the dining room, where Mrs. Chen had prepared an elaborate spread of traditional dishes. Jessica's careful handling of chopsticks revealed years of practice, though her vegetarian diet raised Mrs. Chen's eyebrows. Michelle's knowledge of wine pairing impressed Mr. Chen, but her rushed eating habits made his wife purse her lips. Rachel comfortably navigated the meal's etiquette, sharing stories of her grandmother's cooking in Hunan province. Sarah observed from the corner, feeling like a spectator in her own life story. The cameras captured her subtle reactions, an impressed nod at Jessica's discussion of healthcare accessibility in Asian communities, a shared laugh with Michelle over startup culture jokes, and a lingering glance when Rachel described her passion for teaching Mandarin to second-generation immigrants. As the afternoon progressed, the living room transformed into a stage for cultural collision and connection. Jessica's medical knowledge seamlessly blended with her appreciation for Chinese traditional medicine. Michelle's business acumen was tempered by her surprising expertise in calligraphy. Rachel's modest salary was overshadowed by her rich understanding of cultural heritage and her genuine desire to bridge generational gaps. The production team couldn't have scripted better contrasts. Jessica's structured approach to life versus Michelle's entrepreneurial spontaneity, set against Rachel's traditional values with modern adaptations. Mrs. Chen watched it all unfold, her expression unreadable as she mentally updated her infamous spreadsheet with new observations. The formal dining room of the Chen residence became ground zero for cultural evaluation as Mrs. Chen orchestrated an elaborate 10-course dinner. The production team's cameras captured every nuance of the increasingly tense atmosphere, from the slight tremor in Jessica's hand as she attempted to pick up slippery snow pea shoots to Michelle's momentary hesitation before eating the sea cucumber. Sarah watched in silent horror as her mother conducted what felt more like an imperial court examination than a family dinner. Mrs. Chen's questions flew rapid-fire across the table. Which festivals do you celebrate? How often do you call your parents? What is your stance on living with in-laws? The cameras zoomed in on each candidate's reaction, capturing their varying degrees of composure under pressure. Jessica's medical training helped her maintain a professional demeanor, though her composure cracked slightly when Mrs. Chen inquired about her family's origin in Korea rather than China. "Ah, different customs," Mrs. Chen had commented, causing Sarah to sink lower in her chair. The production team immediately picked up on the tension, repositioning cameras to capture both Sarah's mortification and Jessica's graceful recovery as she detailed her respect for Chinese traditions. Michelle's attempt to steer the conversation toward business success backfired when she mentioned missing last year's Qingming Festival due to an investor meeting. The slight downturn of Mrs. Chen's mouth spoke volumes, though Michelle quickly attempted damage control by discussing her plans to expand her company into Shanghai. Mr. Chen's interest in the business discussion only seemed to irritate his wife further. Rachel, surprisingly, navigated the cultural minefield with practiced ease. Her understanding of Chinese customs went beyond mere knowledge. She lived them. When Mrs. Chen tested her with increasingly obscure traditional practices, Rachel not only knew them, but shared personal stories of celebrating them with her grandmother. The cameras lingered on Mrs. Chen's approving nods, though her expression remained carefully neutral. The breaking point came during the serving of the fish course. As per tradition, no one should flip the fish over after eating one side, a detail Jessica and Michelle had missed. Rachel's subtle intervention, preventing Michelle from committing this faux pas, drew a sharp intake of breath from Mrs. Chen. The moment sparked an impromptu lecture on the symbolism of keeping fish whole, representing completion and abundance. Sarah finally interjected when her mother began questioning their views on traditional Chinese medicine versus Western practices. "Mom, this isn't a cultural proficiency exam," she said, her voice carrying an edge that made the sound technician adjust his levels. The ensuing silence was thick enough to cut with a knife, broken only by the gentle clink of chopsticks against fine porcelain. The production team couldn't have asked for better television. They captured every micro-expression: Michelle's barely concealed frustration, Jessica's professional mask slipping to reveal genuine anxiety, Rachel's quiet confidence, and most importantly, the complex dance between mother and daughter, each trying to navigate tradition and modernity, duty and desire. The formal dining room of the Chen residence became ground zero for cultural evaluation as Mrs. Chen orchestrated an elaborate 10-course dinner. The production team's cameras captured every nuance of the increasingly tense atmosphere, from the slight tremor in Jessica's hand as she attempted to pick up slippery snow pea shoots to Michelle's momentary hesitation before eating the sea cucumber. Sarah watched in silent horror as her mother conducted what felt more like an imperial court examination than a family dinner. Mrs. Chen's questions flew rapid-fire across the table. Which festivals do you celebrate? How often do you call your parents? What is your stance on living with in-laws? The cameras zoomed in on each candidate's reaction, capturing their varying degrees of composure under pressure. Jessica's medical training helped her maintain a professional demeanor, though her composure cracked slightly when Mrs. Chen inquired about her family's origin in Korea rather than China. "Ah, different customs," Mrs. Chen had commented, causing Sarah to sink lower in her chair. The production team immediately picked up on the tension, repositioning cameras to capture both Sarah's mortification and Jessica's graceful recovery as she detailed her respect for Chinese traditions. Michelle's attempt to steer the conversation toward business success backfired when she mentioned missing last year's Qingming festival due to an investor meeting. The slight downturn of Mrs. Chen's mouth spoke volumes, though Michelle quickly attempted damage control by discussing her plans to expand her company into Shanghai. Mr. Chen's interest in the business discussion only seemed to irritate his wife further. Rachel, surprisingly, navigated the cultural minefield with practiced ease. Her understanding of Chinese customs went beyond mere knowledge; she lived them. When Mrs. Chen tested her with increasingly obscure traditional practices, Rachel not only knew them, but shared personal stories of celebrating them with her grandmother. The cameras lingered on Mrs. Chen's approving nods, though her expression remained carefully neutral. The breaking point came during the serving of the fish course. As per tradition, no one should flip the fish over after eating one side, a detail Jessica and Michelle had missed. Rachel's subtle intervention, preventing Michelle from committing this faux pas, drew a sharp intake of breath from Mrs. Chen. The moment sparked an impromptu lecture on the symbolism of keeping fish whole, representing completion and abundance. Sarah finally interjected when her mother began questioning their views on traditional Chinese medicine versus Western practices. "Mom, this isn't a cultural proficiency exam," she said, her voice carrying an edge that made the sound technician adjust his levels. The ensuing silence was thick enough to cut with a knife, broken only by the gentle clink of chopsticks against fine porcelain. The production team couldn't have asked for better television. They captured every micro-expression: Michelle's barely concealed frustration, Jessica's professional mask slipping to reveal genuine anxiety, Rachel's quiet confidence, and most importantly, the complex dance between mother and daughter, each trying to navigate tradition and modernity, duty and desire. The production crew had stepped out for a lunch break, leaving the Chen family alone in their living room. The absence of cameras did nothing to ease the tension that had been building throughout the morning. Sarah paced near the bay window, while Mrs. Chen sat rigidly on her favorite armchair, her iPad displaying her infamous spreadsheet of candidate evaluations. "Ma, this isn't a corporate merger," Sarah finally burst out, her voice carrying years of unspoken frustration. You can't reduce people to data points and cultural checkboxes. Her mother's expression remained unchanged, fingers methodically typing notes about each candidate's performance in the morning's challenges. When I was your age, Mrs. Chen began, a familiar preface that made Sarah's shoulders tense. I had already married your father and moved to America. No dating apps, no love coaches, no choices. Just trust in parents' wisdom. She paused, looking up from her iPad. And look, 35 years of happiness. But that was different, Sarah countered, her tech executive confidence wavering under her mother's steady gaze. You and BA were both from traditional families. You shared the same background, the same expectations. And you think I don't understand modern love? Mrs. Chen interrupted, switching to Mandarin, as she often did when emotions ran high. You think I spent 20 years in Silicon Valley learning nothing about change? Mr. Chen, who had been quietly reading his newspaper in the corner, finally lowered it with a sigh. Your mother learned to use Instagram before you did, he pointed out mildly. She follows all the LGBTQ+ Asian influencers now, even joined some WeChat groups for parents. The revelation stunned Sarah into silence. Her mother, notorious for sending screenshots instead of actual photos, had been secretly immersing herself in modern queer Asian culture. The thought was both touching and mortifying. But why this show? Sarah asked, sinking onto the sofa. Why turn our lives into entertainment? Mrs. Chen set down her iPad, her expression softening. Because, she said carefully, sometimes old doors need new keys to open. When you told us about yourself 3 years ago, I didn't have the right key. Now, maybe this show is our key, not just for us, but for other families like us. Mr. Chen moved to sit between them, his presence a familiar bridge. Your mother spent 2 months researching before agreeing to the show, he revealed. She found every Asian family episode they filmed, analyzed their portrayal of traditional values, even contacted previous participants. The production team had set up an intimate conversation space in the Chen's garden, where carefully placed lighting caught the steam rising from cups of oolong tea. Rachel sat across from Sarah, their knees almost touching on the antique stone bench Mrs. Chen had imported from Suzhou. The cameras, though present, seemed to fade into the background as Rachel began to share her story. My mother reacted exactly like yours when I came out, Rachel said softly, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. She threw herself into every traditional remedy she could find. Matchmakers, temple visits, even a fortune teller in Chinatown who promised to fix me. Sarah's sharp intake of breath caught the boom operator's attention. The cameras zoomed in as Rachel continued, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. For 2 years, we barely spoke. I'd get WeChat messages about potential husbands, links to articles about traditional family values, and photos of my cousins' weddings. Rachel paused, a slight smile touching her lips. Then one day, she showed up at my classroom after school. One of her friend's children was in my Mandarin class, and the kid had told her about how I taught them to write letters to their grandparents in Chinese. The garden's fairy lights twinkled as evening settled in, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere. Mrs. Chen, watching from the kitchen window, found herself moving closer to hear Rachel's story, though the microphones caught every word. She saw the letters on my classroom walls, dozens of them, children of immigrants reconnecting with their heritage, bridges being built across generations. She realized that being gay didn't make me any less Chinese, any less her daughter. Rachel's voice cracked slightly. Now she's my biggest advocate in the community. She runs a support group for Asian parents of LGBT+ children. Sarah reached for Rachel's hand, a gesture that made Mrs. Chen step back from the window. The cameras captured her expression, a complex mixture of recognition, understanding, and something that looked remarkably like hope. The hardest part wasn't coming out, Rachel continued, her thumb unconsciously tracing circles on Sarah's palm. It was feeling like I had to choose between my identity and my culture. But we don't have to choose. We can be both. We can honor our heritage while being true to ourselves. The production team couldn't have scripted a better moment. As Rachel spoke, a gust of wind scattered cherry blossom petals across the garden, creating what would become one of the show's most iconic scenes. Mrs. Chen, still watching from inside, reached for her phone and, for the first time, deleted her spreadsheet of traditional criteria. The moment of decision arrived as golden hour painted the Chen's living room in warm hues. The production team had arranged all three candidates on the antique sofa, while Mrs. Chen stood before them, her usual spreadsheet notably absent from her hands. Sarah watched from the sidelines, her heart racing as her mother cleared her throat. "When I agreed to this show," Mrs. Chen began, her accent thickening with emotion, "I had a very clear idea of what I wanted. Someone who could make perfect Xia Longbao, someone who understood every tradition, someone who could guarantee my daughter's future." She paused, looking directly at the cameras. "I was wrong." The production team scrambled to capture every reaction. Rachel's quiet dignity, Michelle's barely concealed tension, and Jessica's professional composure. But it was Sarah's expression, a mixture of surprise and dawning understanding, that would later become the episode's thumbnail. "Jessica," Mrs. Chen said, turning to the pediatrician, "when you messed up the tea ceremony, you didn't make excuses. You asked to learn. When your dumplings fell apart, you started again. And when that child came into your clinic during filming," she smiled, remembering how Jessica had immediately paused her interview to attend to a young patient with a fever, "you showed me that sometimes new traditions are worth making." The other candidates' shoulders slumped slightly, but there was no bitterness in their expressions, only understanding. Rachel even reached over to squeeze Jessica's hand, a gesture that made Mrs. Chen's eyes shine with unexpected tears. "My daughter is not a business merger or a cultural preservation project," Mrs. Chen continued, her voice steady despite her glistening eyes. "She is my child who deserves someone who will love her enough to keep trying, to keep learning, to keep growing. Someone who understands that tradition isn't about perfection, it's about perseverance." Jessica stood, her medical badge still clipped to her blazer from her emergency hospital visit earlier that day. "I promise," she said softly, "I'll never stop learning. For Sarah, and for you." The cameras panned to capture Sarah's approach, her tech executive confidence momentarily replaced by vulnerable hope. Mrs. Chen stepped back, watching as her daughter and Jessica shared their first genuine moment together, not as candidates in a show, but as two people on the brink of something real. 3 months after the episode aired, the Chen family gathered again, this time without cameras. Jessica moved with practiced ease through their kitchen, her Xia Longbao skills now refined under Mrs. Chen's patient tutelage. The episode had garnered over 5 million views on streaming platforms, making it Love Buster's most viral content to date. Sarah's phone buzzed constantly with messages from LGBTQ+ Asian youth who'd found courage in their story. Her Instagram followers had quadrupled, mostly young professionals seeking advice on navigating traditional family dynamics. The hashtag #LoveBusterLGBTQ had spawned dozens of coming-out stories within the Asian community. Mrs. Chen had become an unexpected icon. Her WeChat inbox overflowed with messages from other parents seeking guidance on accepting their LGBT+ children. She'd started hosting monthly dim sum gatherings for parents struggling with similar journeys, turning her traditional matchmaking skills toward building community support networks instead. The production company had called twice, pitching a spin-off series focused on traditional Asian families embracing modern love. Mrs. Chen declined politely, but agreed to appear as a guest speaker at PFLAG events, sharing her story of transformation from traditional matchmaker to LGBTQ+ ally. Jessica's pediatric practice had grown, with many Asian families specifically requesting her as their children's doctor. Her waiting room now featured Chinese children's books alongside medical pamphlets, and her staff had learned basic Mandarin phrases to help nervous parents feel more comfortable. Rachel and Michelle remained close friends with the family. Rachel's cultural education program had expanded with Mrs. Chen's help, now including workshops for LGBTQ+ Asian youth seeking to reconnect with their heritage. Michelle's startup had pivoted to include traditional Asian design elements in their AI fashion recommendations, with Sarah's tech team providing consulting support. Mr. Chen watched it all with quiet pride, particularly during Sunday dinners when Jessica would debate traditional medicine with his wife, or help Sarah practice her rusty Mandarin. Their home had become a subtle blend of old and new. Modern smart home devices alongside traditional paper cuttings. Hospital schedules pinned next to lunar calendar festivities. The episode's most touching moment, according to viewer comments, hadn't been the selection itself, but rather a quiet scene caught by accident. Mrs. Chen teaching Jessica how to wrap dumplings after the cameras had officially stopped rolling, their laughter bridging generations of tradition and change. It was this scene that kept being shared across social media platforms, accompanied by thousands of personal stories about family, acceptance, and love. 3 months had changed everything, yet nothing fundamental had changed at all. The Chen family still gathered for dim sum, still debated tradition versus modernity, still navigated the complex waters of cultural identity. But now they did it together, their story becoming part of a larger narrative about how love, in all its forms, could strengthen rather than break traditional family bonds.